Hi there, everyone. Welcome to this live and interactive event with British Council's Teaching English. I'm Naomi, and I'm joined by Kath Bilsborough and Robert Martínez from our Creating Lessons that Work mini event. If you're at the event, you'll have heard Kath talking about creating classroom materials and Robert talking about learning outcomes. So this is a follow-up session where you can ask them all your questions that you didn't get a chance to ask last week. So please put all your questions into the comments box, and we really look forward to hearing from you. So first, I'm just going to quickly introduce both Kath and Robert. So Kath is a teacher, educator and ELT author, well known for her course books for primary and secondary. As well as course books and digital courses, she writes free access materials and lesson plans for the British Council and several ELT publishers. She's worked with teachers around the world on developing materials from low resource printed worksheets to highly polished video animations. So welcome, Kath.
Thank you. Lovely introduction.
Thank you. And Robert, here, he's worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in numerous countries and is now based in Spain. He's passionate about language assessment, technology integration, and teaching education. He's a CELTA assessor and an EAQUALS inspector. He speaks Italian, Spanish, and can get by in French and Portuguese. Now, Robert, I'm just going to ask you actually to switch out your microphone because the drilling just then was much louder with your current headset. So if you could maybe go back to the original setup, I think that might be better.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
It was very
okay, Zoom audio device.
You sound really good.
Better this way?
Better. Oh yes, the drilling is now very faint. That's so much better. Thank you. Okay, so everyone, we've got a couple of people here saying hi here. We've got Melissa in Myanmar and Sue, I think, is that Vietnamese she's speaking? So welcome to everyone. If you've got questions for Kath and Robert, pop them in the comments box. Oh wow, that's loud. I want to start with a question for the audience and for both Robert and Kath. What materials have you created recently? And I'm going to start with Kath here.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. So the materials I've created most recently have actually been for a teacher trainer context and for a course that I'm developing. So they're materials for teachers who are learning how to create materials, ironically. So there's a kind of circular thing going on there. And the very last thing that I created was a quiz based on some previous materials, just to check that the course participants have understood what they've learned. So that was quite good fun. It's quite nice. I enjoy that kind of thing, thinking of quiz questions. So that's the last thing I created.
Great. And Robert, what about you?
For me, it was also for a professional development session here at work, and it was on 5 practical ways on how to record pronunciation in the classroom to encourage our teachers to do it more actively, to work on pronunciation. And I really enjoyed it as well, like as Kath, because what I enjoy when creating materials is thinking, how can I make this engaging, whether they're teachers or students? How can I take a step back and they actually do it so that they're more doing things? And I think that reminding myself constantly of that actually really helps. I really enjoyed that creative process. It's like, no, this is too much of me. I need to step back. How can they do it? That was really, really nice. And the session went well as well. So it's
fantastic. Oh, that's great. Okay, we've got a response here from Rachna in, I believe, Mauritius. She created macaroni necklaces to help her pupils with counting. Oh, how fun.
That's lovely. That is. I remember receiving a macaroni necklace from my son when he was at primary school that he'd made, But it wasn't to help with counting. That's genius.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really
such a
nice.
good idea.
Yeah, because I remember making one, but making a house, not really with macaroni, not really for counting there, but so that's great. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so I have another question here. I've got one here about learning outcomes for Robert. I was wondering this after watching your session. Do you think teachers have to use the structure that you suggested, or is it okay to go impromptu a little bit?
That's a very good question, because I've been asked that question a few times, actually. I don't think we have to be prescriptive. You know, the idea with that mnemonic aid for learning outcomes is that personally I follow it, because when I chant it and I'm preparing my sessions, it helps me remember, because that's the whole point of the mnemonic aid, to help you remember that you're not leaving anything out. And those 6 parts are I think important. But if it works in any other way for anyone, I think that's fine. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way, or that specific mnemonic. I created that mnemonic because it helped me, and then once it's there, you share it. But I think the important thing is that the whole point of learning outcomes is that we think about the students rather than ourselves, because it's very easy to just go back and start lecturing or start talking, and we forget that that we're the classroom for them, not all the way around. So as long as, you know, a different order or different foci is there, I think are there. Whatever works, but always remembering that it is about the learners. I think that's the important thing.
That's a really good point. Kath, when you create learning outcomes, do you have a similar structure to Robert's, or do you have a structure you use?
That's a really good question, because usually if I'm writing for a publisher, then the publisher, when they send me the brief and they send me the instructions and they tell me what I need to include, etc., we normally have a list of learning outcomes that sometimes we're told in this unit, in this section, we have to achieve these outcomes. But sometimes we have a long list of learning outcomes, and we have to, as we're developing the materials, decide where they might work best. And we have a certain amount of autonomy on that. But it's quite a skill that you need to learn, because some learning outcomes, you know, work naturally with particular skills, etc., obviously, and others don't work so well. So it's like, I always describe it as, it's like doing a great big jigsaw puzzle. So you've got the vocabulary you need to be practicing, or the grammar point, etc., the skills or the sub skills that you're developing, and then you've got the outcomes, they and other things as well, and they all slot together. If I'm writing something that I'm self-publishing, if you like, or I'm in charge, then I would probably start with the outcomes. Instead of start at the end and work backwards, because it's so easy to just forget. It's just so easy to think, you know, I've seen people create materials, and then when we ask them what the outcomes are, if we've been doing teacher development, they like, and then they look in and they think, oh, it could be this or it could be this, but really that should be the starting point, and we can add some more outcomes later, or we might change them as we go through the process. So yeah, bit of a roundabout answer to that question, but yeah, it depends.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point you make about always starting with the outcome with whatever you're planning or creating, is because, yeah, it's our teaching materials, like everything we do in our lesson should be leading us towards a goal.
Absolutely,
yeah. Oh, so that's great. So now I have another really good question I've been dying to ask the both of you. What is your number one tip for creating materials for your own students? So going back to the classroom rather, what is your number one tip for creating materials for students? Who would like to answer this one first? Who's got a tip at the tip of their tongue?
Oh, no.
Okay, great.
For me is the relevance of those materials for my students, because the thing is that very often coursebooks are wonderful, right? And I really like using them, but very often maybe we may tend to just like go through the book as if it was all there is. And whenever I feel like I need to create materials, for me the first question is, how can I make it relevant? How can I tie it to their own lives or to their own context, so that they feel that it is about them, and also that they have more to say, because that's the whole point. If you can feel that it is something that you can relate to, you're probably going to say more. If it is something totally alien, you're going to go like, well, I don't know. And especially with teens, that's often the case, like, oh, I don't know. So it's finding that hook, that with their real life, which is difficult to, whenever I'm making the new materials, because maybe the text specifically in the coursebook was not, knowing my students, I know that it's not gonna gel. And I find it difficult to try and move it around so that I find that link.
Great points. Yeah, that's really useful. And now, Kath, what about you?
Yeah, well, I agree 100% with what Robert just said. The problem that I often have is that I'm writing materials. Yeah, I don't always know the students who are going to be using them. But if, as you just said, for your own classes, I think my number one tip would be keep it simple in every aspect. So firstly, for example, don't assume that you can do all these things in that period of time, because as teachers, we know that we will never be able to do that. So start simple. We can always add some extra suggestions for ourselves to do extra things afterwards. But if we keep it simple, then we make sure that the core of the materials, the actual main part of the materials, will be done and will work. If we have too much stuff, there's a danger that we miss out the really important part. And then I think in terms of design, for example, sometimes we go a bit crazy. I know I used to, with colors and fonts and pictures, and it's not helpful. Sometimes we just need to make it, come back to simple with lots of white space and just like the minimum, one or two fonts, one or two colors. We're not trying to, I've seen some materials that might look marvelous, but when you actually analyze content, there's nothing much there. It's much better to spend that time and effort really thinking about, an activity that's going to prompt speaking, or, the support on the page, etc. So yeah, keep it simple. That would be my number one.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a good point. I think Galina there in the comments is agreeing with you wholeheartedly as well. And welcome to everyone who's joined us. And we've got Angela, we've got Oda, we've got Evans, we've got Astigik. I'm sorry, I probably mangled your name there. We've got Lorena. We have a question from Astigik that's not quite on topic today. If we have time at the end, we'll get to that. But we're really looking for questions on creating materials and writing learning outcomes. So if you've got any questions for Kath and Robert about those two topics, fire away, and if we have time, we'll get to the other question at the end. We have from Rachna. She shared her number one tip. Is understanding her learners, connection, sharing, engaging, and doing by learning. I think that's about 4 or 5 tips, but what do you think of those points, Robert?
Connection. I don't know if you're probably familiar with the late Rita Pearson. She was a school teacher in Florida, and she had a TED talk called "Every Kid Deserves a Champion," and it is all about the power of connection. And I couldn't agree more, especially nowadays when students are changing. They've changed. I started, this is my 30th year teaching, and looking at teenagers now, they are different. They're definitely different. I'm sure you will agree. So is the power of that connection. Someone said to me once, I don't need to like them. I mean, I just want to teach them and then that's it. As Rita Pearson said in her video, children, I mean teenagers and learners in general, they don't learn from people they don't like. And so if I don't like what I do, I'm sure they're going to sense that. And that's when conflict, I think, usually happens. So for definitely connection would be for me top of the board. Connection, creating that rapport and being sincere. I think that we're lucky that we can change lives with what we do. So if there's that connection is missing, I think is probably not the right job for us.
Yeah, I really like Rachna's comment there, and I'm assuming because I think Rachna was the person who did the macaroni counting.
Yes.
So she's probably teaching children, but I think this works as Robert just said. You need that kind of rapport to build rapport with your students, no matter what the age or context. And I think by creating materials, we can do this quite, it's quite a good way of doing it, because when we create materials with our own students in mind, we are showing them that we care, and and they will notice. So another tip might be to actually ask for the students to help provide some of the content that we're going to use to create materials. So for example, if we're going to be talking about photos, like in some of the exams where you have to compare or contrast photos, etc., describe what's going on. One way of getting that connection that we just mentioned is by asking the students themselves to provide the photos, because if they provide the photos, they are automatically engaged even before the lesson begins. They've got that kind of that extra little push there, if you like. So I would encourage a kind of not necessarily entirely learner generated, but certainly working together. I think a lot of the educationalists for child psychologists in terms of education talk about that creating things together, like Montessori spoke about that. So you don't just, teacher doesn't just go in and do everything. They create this learning opportunity and experience, and materials is somewhere that you might like. There's somewhere I think teachers learn a lot. I know when I've done this kind of thing with my students, I've come away learning loads, because they'll bring up maybe people that you've never heard of, music that you've never heard of, whatever. But it can be quite exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, definitely. And some of what you said here, I think, ties in with Evan's comment here. Some students support Evans to create marvelous materials. Once a student helped create a map with a circuit to teach prepositions. Doesn't that sound creative?
Yeah, that sounds amazing, actually. In fact, most of us have in our classroom, we talk about the students being a resource, if you like. And within our classrooms, we very often have somebody who's good at drawing, somebody who's good at, everyone's good at something. And it's a good idea to tap into this and get them, creating, like, well, in this case, a map with a circuit. But it could be anything, couldn't it? Somebody might be good at video editing or whatever. These days, a lot of, for me personally as well, a lot of the tech skills my students would be much better at those than me. So working with the students sounds like a very good idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, we have Karen here who's moderating in the chat, and she's been listening to songs that her students have suggested for class, and connecting her to her students. That's a lovely idea.
Hi, Karen. Yeah, that's it's brilliant, isn't it? Because otherwise we might never come across these musicians, singers, groups, whatever. It's brilliant.
And the ones that we know are clearly out of date.
Speak for yourself, Robert.
No, I'm saying because I remember, I really like Madonna, and I remember suggesting some songs for my teenage group for certificate preparation, and they were like, "What? No." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So, well, same things. Which is your favorite song, and making them listen, then going back and listening to them, listening to the lyrics, and then seeing how I could create an activity from those lyrics. Yeah.
I think that sort of ties with rather than a tip of what to do, one tip for what not to do is to assume that your students are going to be as passionate as you are about, a song, a film, a place, or just because we like it, in fact, that's probably a very good reason why they won't like it if they're teenagers. So
yeah,
it's true. Yeah. We have a question here from Diane. So talking about creating materials before, before getting to the topic, or trying to create materials related to topics, I'm assuming from the course book. So I think this is asking about whether you start with a lesson from a course book and then try and add materials to it, or do you think it's better to do it the other way around? So I think
there's no correct answer here. I think it's most of us, I'm sure Robert will agree with me, most of us start creating materials by kind of we're using what we've already got as a springboard, and as you mentioned earlier, Robert, you come across a text and you might think that's not really relevant to my students' experience, so we will keep everything else maybe in the unit, but this reading I'm going to change the text and then create something. But I think there's no right answer here. I think it's a good question from Diane because it shows that she's really thinking about the process, but I think both ways are fine. You might decide to create something very, very simple as an extra resource for something that already exists. So you might be using a course book that's perfectly fine, and you want some extra practice with a language point, or you might create a game or a revision activity, etc. Or you might, if it depends how much freedom you've got as well, because in some schools around the world you haven't got the freedom to just create anything you like. You have to follow strictly the curriculum that's in place. So if the book is good or the course materials are good, then there's you don't need to reinvent the wheel, if you like, but you can use your creativity to make some extra something or other. Would you agree with that, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, for example, I found that I finished the unit and I have some extra time before I move on. So I may create something brand new simply because I have, as you say, the freedom, maybe I have the time. Some other times it's just, because you just have that flexibility. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that. Welcome everyone out there. We have some more people coming in. We've got Teresa, we've got Ikram, we've got Azalea, we've got Galina. Hello, welcome everyone. Now I have a comment here from Maria. Let me just find that. Talking about materials being relevant to students' needs, linking back to relevance, which I think is very important. So I'm curious how you would tie this into the learning outcomes, Robert, because I think students' needs and learning outcomes are very closely linked. So I'm curious how you'd tie this comment into learning outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I write, I usually start with looking at what I'm supposed to be covering, thinking what we've covered, and then how the learning outcomes for me are like, how am I going to make this accessible to my class? And so how am I going to make it relevant? When writing the learning outcomes, I try and think of, I mean, this is why context is so important, because the way I write those learning outcomes for this group, maybe if I have the same group but at a different time, it's going to be slightly different. You know, they say that one size fits all, this doesn't, because each group is different, and when only we know the specific traits and characteristics and needs of that specific group. So how I try to make them relevant is when writing them, once I've written them and I look at the materials and think of the students, I know that one student or two or three in particular don't like doing certain things. So I go back to my learning outcomes to see how I can make sure that the actions that I want to do, what they will have done by the end of the lesson, is somehow aligned to what I know they'd like. For example, right now I have a class of 10 to 11-year-old girls, and they're great, but they don't, you know, they have ants in their pants. So I know that I need to make sure that there are at least in the lesson at least 2 or 3 different activities in which they will have to stand up and do something, because otherwise they're going to get restless. And I totally get them. I'm hyper myself. So that's how I think learning the learning outcomes, writing the learning outcomes, looking at the materials that you have and thinking about how they're going to make sense to the students. But only we have that key because we know them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And now, Kath, I'd like to ask you how, when you're creating materials, how do you ensure that they're relevant to your students' needs? Have you got any tips for making sure materials are relevant to the students' needs?
Well, the obvious one would be to conduct a needs analysis at the very beginning of the process. And I think that this is something that we can do in different ways. So, for example, a publisher would do this in a big way, if you like, in some kind of market research and surveys and speaking to students, teachers, etc. If we're creating materials for students who we're going to teach, you know, if you imagine if you're a teacher, you've got a new class, you can do this by you can do it in a number of ways. You could have a little questionnaire that they answer privately. You know, you can check their language levels, if you like, through some kind of, well, either a test or ask them to write something or talk about things. And then you can ask them about preferences. You can ask them about interests. I think these days, one interesting thing that it depends on the context very much, but for example, it might be very useful to ask your students about other languages that they speak. So obviously this depends very much on where we're based on the makeup of the class. But in Spain, for example, where I live and work, a lot of the areas in Spain might have classes with, there was one teacher that I met years back who was teaching in a school in the south of Spain, and there were 24 languages, first languages spoken in his class. So he had children, they were from every corner of the world. And he was brilliant because he tapped into that, and it had a direct influence in what he did in the class. And I think that that's something we could, you know, I think we need to know our students or get as much information as possible. We don't have to get it all at the beginning. Obviously, we don't have to just bombard them with, you know, interrogation or anything, but we can build up slowly, keep a record of, so that if we do have, you know, multilingual, you know, classroom, we can, it would be nice to celebrate that rather than just, you know, wash it under the table, brush it under the table, and, you know, this kind of thing. So yeah, I would do some kind of needs analysis, and it could be done even with children, you know, just observation and thinking of techniques where you can, you know, see the kind of things they enjoy playing, the games they play, the music they like, the food they like, what if they've traveled, if they haven't, if they've got dreams, or so yeah, gathering information.
Very good points. Wow, this 30 minutes has literally flown by. I can't believe it's it's over already. You've shared so many great tips and so many great insights, and we had a great audience here today. So everyone, thank you so much. Thank you, Kath, and thank you, Robert, and thank you to all our fantastic followers out there all around the world. It's lovely to see your comments and questions. And I promised Robert, I would, if you're interested in seeing more of Robert's materials, his YouTube channel is here.
Oh yes, that's right. Thank you, Bird. Yeah, it's short videos about methodology, about things that my own teachers in my team ask often, or people on the channel say, "Oh, can you make a video on how to do X, Y, Z?" So they're usually 3 to 5 minutes.
Oh, that's such a nice length. I mean, yeah, such a good length. Just something short. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and goodbye. I'm going to.
Thank you.
Thank you.